Y'all, I was so excited a few weeks ago. Jess and I were out finishing up our last minute Christmas shopping, knocking those last couple things off the old gift list before wrapping up. And we were in Books A Million in the mall. And as I was turning down one of the aisles, I looked upon one of the shelves, and what should my eyes see but these? The ultimate piece of Christian pop culture 90s nostalgia, the What Would Jesus Do bracelet. Well, these things were the epitome of Christian witness in the 90s and early 2000s. If you were like me, I wore one of these bad boys every day. Problem is that's kind of the extent of it. I wore it. Many people wore these bracelets as a symbol of their faith, and at the beginning, maybe, an exercise in personal discipleship. But the reality is many years later, the What Would Jesus Do bracelet almost became a joke more than an expression. Of course, I picked one of these up for myself, picked one up for each one of the boys, and God kind of had a good laugh, because I think just a week or so later, Miss Amy gave these out during Children's Story to all of our kids. And so these What Would Jesus Do bracelets have kind of made their way throughout our church again here, kind of a revival of sorts. Maybe your kids or one of your grandma or grandson or granddaughter picked one of these up during Children's Story. So maybe you've seen the revival of the What Would Jesus Do bracelet at Mount Zion. The challenge is that Jesus really does want us to ask questions like, what would Jesus do? That as Christians, our lives should be based around these kinds of questions. Is how, if in my situation, would Jesus respond? If Jesus were in my shoes right now, what would he do? If Jesus was faced with the same challenge or complication that I am, well, how would Jesus live? It's a really important question for us as Christians. And that is the thing, Christians, right? The word Christian means little Christ, implying that we live our lives, or aim to live our lives as Jesus would, and in the same pattern that Jesus had. 1 Peter chapter 2 puts it this way. Let's read in verses 21 to the end of the chapter. This suffering is all part of the work God has given you. Christ, who suffered for you, is your example. Follow in his steps. He never sinned, never told a lie, never answered back when insulted. When he suffered, he did not threaten to get even. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. He personally carried the load of our sins in his own body when he died on the cross, so that we can be finished with sin and live a good life from now on. For his wounds have healed ours. Like sheep, you wandered away from God, but now you have returned to your shepherd, the guardian of your souls, who keeps you safe from all attacks. This week in our Firm Foundation study, we're going to turn our attention to Jesus, the second person in the Trinity, and ask ourselves, who is Jesus and why should I believe in him? Ultimately, that is the defining question for many Christians. Who is Jesus? For what you do with Jesus will define what you do with everything else about this faith of ours. If you believe Jesus to be the Son of God, the perfect Redeemer of our souls, if you believe Jesus to be the only source of salvation, then you will embrace a whole lot of things about the Bible, and you will resist a whole set of other things. But if you only believe Jesus to be a good teacher or a good man or one of many ways to heaven, then you will accept a whole different kind of teaching and read the Bible in a whole different way. Friends, ultimately, what you do with Jesus will answer what you do with a whole lot of the other stuff that's in this Bible that we carry. But back to the what would Jesus do question. Because ultimately, if we're going to ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? We probably need to have a pretty good idea on what Jesus did. So often as Christians, we try to answer these questions by asking ourselves, what would a Christian do? What would the pastor do? What would my friend who I admire do? That's not the question. The question is, what would Jesus do? In 1 Peter chapter 2, it says that Christ has suffered for you. He is your example. Follow his steps. And as Christians, we are to be imitators of Jesus. But how often do we not inform ourselves on what Jesus did? We look at other people and think that we'll do what they're doing because they're supposed to be doing what Jesus is doing. You ever thought about cutting out a pattern with a saw? A saw blade is about 1/8 of an inch off. So if I cut on the line, and I cut just on the inside of the line, my next cut's going to be 1/8 of an inch too short. And then my next one's going to be 1/4 of an inch too short. And then my next one is going to be 3/8 of an inch too short. You see what happens? If we just cut off the next thing, then we'll miss the mark by just that much more. Friends, as Christians, we're to pattern our lives after Jesus. Not after pastors, not after other Christians, not after other people, but after Christ. Which means, if we're going to ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? We need to start really making sure that we know what Jesus did. We know who Jesus is. Not what the pastor tells us, or not what our friend tells us, not what the TV evangelist tells us. We need to know for ourselves, which means we need to get in the scriptures, and we need to be making sure we're following after this pattern. And so this week we're going to start unpacking, who is Jesus and why should I believe him anyway? Not that so that we can run after each other, but so that we might pattern our lives after the author and perfecter of our faith, Jesus the Christ. So in preparation for Sunday, I want you to think about that. Who is Jesus to you? And how is your life evidence of how you are following him? I'll see you Sunday.